It's a pleasure to be here again at the Japan Society and lead another experts panel. And we've got a powerhouse tonight. I think we'll be spending a good deal of time on the last bit of tonight's topic, which is looming challenges. Tonight we want to dive into how Asia is approaching those challenges, many of which are, to be quite honest with you, emanating from Washington right now. The latest being the decision by the new Trump administration to scrap its involvement in the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal. Talk of protectionism and an American first policy is certainly something Japan, China, and frankly the rest of the world will now have to adjust to, as the policy change, at least rhetorically, is an abrupt turn. I can't remember such an abrupt turn with the change of administration for a while now. And to be fair, whenever there's a change in government or party control, there's uncertainty, trepidation, and concern, but also opportunities. What I believe we'll be dealing with in the years ahead is deciphering what is said from the executive office in Washington to what is actually implemented in policies, and they might be very different. I think we have to get used to that idea as we're witnessing. We've entered 2017 with a solid U.S. economy that's getting back toward a more traditional monetary policy. It's also likely getting fiscal stimulus, something that's been missing because of the austerity required by the Great Recession. And we also have a Japanese economy that's expanded by about an annualized 2.2% rate in the third quarter, and that beat expectations. Bank of Japan Governor Kuroda holds an upbeat view of the global economic growth on the prospect of a strengthening U.S. economy to a great degree. So inflation long sought, well, maybe it'll finally materialize. We're not sure. China's economy is growing at less than half the rate it was in 2007, and that's probably a good thing. Recently, Reuters reported exclusively that China was targeting a rate of 6.5% GDP growth in 2017, but there are growing concerns about containing its debt risks. The world's second largest economy likely grew 6.7% last year, but needs to maintain a 6.5% rate through 2020 in order to double its GDP and per capita incomes from 2010 levels. However, it's also an economy in transition, as we all know, and it has to navigate a more hawkish tone from the White House. So again, that Washington influence in Asia. India, too, is playing a larger role in global growth, but firmly in the emerging market mode rather than a developed market mode. And reforms, too, are underway, but with India, it's always fits and starts, as I've observed over the years. Its growth rate is expected to be 7.1% in the fiscal year ending in March, from 7.6% a year earlier. However, private economists see growth dropping into the 6.3, 6.4% range after the disruption from the government's scrapping of high-value banknotes in November. So tonight we're joined by three distinguished economists to help us better understand the growth prospects and looming challenges, as I said. I'll leave their bios to you. You have them all in front of you. So we have with us Adam Posen, S.K. Sakikibara, and Shangjin Wei. And so I'd like to start by asking each of our panelists the following question. And I'll start with Professor Sakikibara. And then we can go to Mr. Posen and then Professor Wei. So what is the scrapping of TPP by the Americans meant to your view of Asia's economic growth prospects?
Well, TPP was considered to be a favorable factor for many Japanese, and Japanese diet just passed, the TPP agreement just before, Trump has scrapped that. But my view is somewhat of a minority view. I didn't really, think that the TPP was such a great sort of addition.
Why not?
Well, to me, TPP means the Americanization of the institution. And Japan should probably retain some of uniquely Japanese sort of aspects in the Japanese economy. So that's why, I was against, TPP. Take, for example, Japan has a postal saving system, which used to be owned by the government, but now it's private. But if TPP agreement is made, then postal savings sort of institution may be criticized for being still, very closely connected with the government. Mm-hmm. So, or some of the, construction contracts in local sort of cities in Japan favors local construction companies, which is also against TPP. Mm-hmm. So, but those things are quite important because Japanese construction companies' numbers are very large, and unless we favor the local, constructions, in local sort of constructions, mm-hmm. We may have bankruptcies after bankruptcies. So that my sort of view is we need to retain some of uniquely Japanese aspects of mm-hmm. the Japanese institutions, and TPP is not necessarily good for the Japanese economy. But I would say this is a minority view, okay?
Okay. Dr. Posen.
Thank you, Daniel. Let me try to take it beyond Japan. TPP was never about big cash on the barrelhead immediately for the big economies like the US and Japan. It was about trying to steer the orientation, the development, the rules for the economies that are growing in the region, which of course is Thailand, Vietnam. Prospectively, ideally, it was to include Philippines and Indonesia.
That may be not so much anymore, given the way things have gone.
Well, but that was the vision, mm-hmm. And so the change is really about the lost opportunities for Japan. Professor Sakakibara probably wouldn't like it, but part of the goal was to help Prime Minister Abe change the agricultural system in Japan. And make it more globally competitive and also much less costly for Japanese consumers, which required giving up some traditional characteristics. So it's very much a lost opportunity. Does it change the world, change the short-term growth prospects? Very little. There is the possibility either that the TPP nations without the US do something. There is the possibility that the Chinese-led so-called RCEP does something positive. And there's also the possibility, although unfortunately I doubt it, that the US government, despite its claims about forsaking TPP, decides they don't want to leave Asia's growth and to no role for the US and comes back. But it's not a short-term danger.
Right. Professor.
Daniel, well, to me, TPP is a very mixed bag of something that could be very, very good and something that's less good. What's very, very good is it sets high standards in some areas. Insist on, for example, reforms of state-owned enterprises, which could be an important driver for reforms in countries like Vietnam. So Vietnam was expected to benefit a lot from the passage of a TPP. Interestingly, when TPP is doomed by the current U.S. administration, I read very mixed reactions within China. So China is excluded by TPP. So some therefore thought, the end of TPP is good because TPP, by artificially put advantage to firms inside TPP, it gives disadvantage to Chinese firms. So end of that is good. But others thought it's not so good because they were hoping that having TPP there will inspire Chinese government to continue their reforms, state-owned sector reforms, negative list kind of reforms. Therefore, end of TPP potentially reduced a momentum for reforms within China. So I thought that's kind of interesting. But the other part of a TPP that's less desirable is, is to recognize that free trade agreement is not the same thing as free trade because it creates artificial advantage for member firms at the expense of firms from non-member countries. So it's also a source of distortion. In that sense, any trade agreement, free trade agreement, as an endpoint is not good. So if it's a stepping stone to a broader set of trade liberalization, it could be good. Now, the end of TPP could create space for that kind of things, but that's not what the administration intends to do. The administration intends to administration in Washington intends to replace TPP by a set of bilateral deals, which will not solve the distortion problem.
The bilateral deals will not solve the distortion.
Bilateral deals will still create, the difference between firms inside a treaty and firms outside treaties, because they will face different tariff when they export to the U.S., export to other member countries of a bilateral agreement. This artificial difference in tariff is a source of distortion, and especially this kind of distortion is especially problematic in today's globalized world, global value chain world. A typical product, let's say electronics or car manufacturing, often involves inputs from U.S., Japan, China, and elsewhere. By leaving some countries outside any regional trade agreement, you potentially have to essentially leave most efficient producers out, artificially favoring less efficient producers just because they happen to be residing inside of FTA member countries. So in that sense, end of that is need not be bad news, except the current administration doesn't intend to replace this by broader trade liberalization. And it's interesting to note that the Chinese president in Davos became the new champion for global trade, free trade. Setting aside the motive, the world actually needs someone to champion for continual liberal trade order.
Dr. Posen, you raised the point of RCEP. So I wanted to know if you could expand a little bit on it. I mean, my basic question is, does it become the de facto trade policy for the region? And what do you think about the fact that China was seen as the image created, real or not, image created in Davos was that China was the free trader and open.
I think there's a lot of virtue, a lot of validity to that image. Not that they're a free trader, as Shang Jin indicated. The support for state-owned enterprises, the favoring of domestic firms, the lack of protection for intellectual property rights. I mean, there's a lot of things you would not want from China.
Right.
But the idea that there's a vacuum of leadership and that, at least ostensibly, the new U.S. administration is, as you said, you didn't put it this way, but is turning its back on the world order and the rules that the U.S. helped create. Gives a real both opportunity and need for China and, frankly, the EU and Japan to step up. And, I think, and I said this in a speech in Brussels last week, I think it's now up to the EU and China to save us all, and I hope they do. And as Shang Jin said, I mean, he and I probably differ a little on this, in a sense, it doesn't matter if it's selfish motivations by China. As long as it is constructively harnessed. And so when you say about RCEP, I mean, the issue with RCEP, I forget what, regional
comprehensive economic partnership.
Right.
Yeah,
Co-prosperities here.
Yep.
It doesn't have the content TPP does. And it's probably going to be what we call a lower standard agreement, meaning it will not open up countries as evenly and as much as TPP would have. On the other hand, if it forces China to open up its markets a little and have the developing countries of Asia get access, then it's a good thing. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, apart from TPP, intra-Asian trade has been increasing quite dramatically.
Sure.
And Asia is being sort of integrated. And with regard to Japan, 20% of Japanese export goes to China. If you include Taiwan and Hong Kong, it's more than 30%. Japanese export to US is less than 15%. So that China, at least in terms of interaction of the economy, has become the major, most important sort of economic partner of Japan. And that needs to be recognized. Although United States is the major partner in terms of national security, in terms of economic interactions, China and Japan are highly interdependent.
I want to strongly second the importance of that because we saw right after President Trump fulfilled his promise and withdrew from TPP, Australia, I think New Zealand, a couple other member countries said, well, we can go ahead without the U.S. We have to change a few things. We can go ahead without the U.S. And Prime Minister Abe from Japan came out almost immediately and said, no point in going ahead without the U.S.
No, that's very interesting.
And I thought that was disappointing from Prime Minister Abe, frankly.
What does that tell you, though? What do you gather from that?
It relates to what SK said. I
Yeah.
mean, it says that on the one hand, he's very concerned about the national security aspect, which is perfectly legitimate. But one
And
would
he's
like,
coming to the U.S.
right. And he's very concerned, in part through, let us say, the good auspices of the Japan Society. He got access to President Trump, and he doesn't want to mess up that relationship.
Yeah.
But I think it's short-sighted.
I want to add 2 points about potential China working with other countries in pushing for maintaining and advancing a liberal world order. One doesn't need to be too cynical about this for the following reason. China has been a major beneficiary of globalization, trade globalization, FDI globalization, and so on. Most countries, in fact, are, just that China recognizes this much more clearly than apparently right now than the U.S. So I think, therefore, China is among those countries that have a genuine interest in seeing the world does not go back to a protectionist mode. That's number one. Number two, why, in some sense, one can see TPP is a high standard. TPP doesn't have to be, was not going to be the best practice either. There are areas in the world trading system where reform is needed, and U.S. has not been a champion for that. Let me give you an example. The world trading system has this anti-dumping rule, which most sensible scholars and people think it's actually not the best kind of anti-dumping is meant to deal with anti-market, anti-competition conduct in cross-border transactions. The problem is, that's the good motivation. The problem is the actual practice. Anti-dumping is often used as a quasi-protectionist tools by many countries. Chinese firms happen to be the most common victims of anti-dumping rules. And we actually have some idea about
victims, or
victims.
Or are they the ones that the rules are trying to protect everybody else from?
Well, that's the thing. I'm saying so the rules are often, anti-dumping is often actually used not just for dealing with anti-market things. Actual implementation, for example, the standard rule here is that you can allow for using third-party costs to judge whether this, and most sensible scholars conclude that's actually not per se a pro-market behavior. Scholars know what is the right way to do this, which is that most countries have domestic anti-monopoly rules, and the right way to do this is to harmonize, to use the same kind of a standard, same kind of procedure that deal with anti-monopoly, anti-competitive practice at home, and use it in cross-border transactions. That's an area in which the world trading system needs reform, and TPP doesn't even talk about that either. So there are also opportunities, for other countries to promote desirable reforms that U.S. has not been championing so far.
Sorry, just on this specific point, a colleague of mine at the Peterson Institute, Dr. Carolyn Freund, who used to be at the World Bank, a very good trade economist, will be releasing a new paper by her shortly, in which he takes somewhat the approach that Jim was talking about, and she looks across industries around the world and says, how concentrated are they? And what you find is, in a sense, trade has been working, that in industry after industry, the concentration ratios have been going down, meaning competition from new entrants has made it less monopolistic or oligopolistic. But the notable exception is where Chinese state-owned enterprises are present in global markets, concentration has gone up. Not Chinese private firms. Chinese private firms are like other private firms and in this data, and I think it's right. They compete and everything else. But the state-owned enterprises, like in steel, they actually tend to exert their dominant position and take up more concentration. So it cuts both ways.
So that'll be a very interesting paper when it comes out.
There will be an event with her and Nicholas Lardy at the Institute February 7th. Tune into the live webcast.
Professor Wei, I wanted to get back to you for a moment on China's economic slowdown, right? It's enviable, the rates of economic growth, but given its outsized role in the region and the global economy, how do you view this slowdown? Is it normal or is it impending disaster?
First, a note on the outsized role. Even with the slowdown, China contributes roughly 30% to global growth last few years. China has been the largest contributor to global GDP growth since about 2002. Now, the country, of course, is growing much less fast today than 5 or 6 years ago. Now, understandable, it's a source of potential anxiety for people in the country as well as abroad. And therefore, it's useful to understand why we see a slowdown there, because understanding the reason for slowing down matters for example, should the government use demand stimulus to deal with slowdown or not, right? If it's let's say, driven by cyclical factors, you want to use demand measure to deal with it. If it's driven by structural factors, then you need you have to live with it, or you have to focus on structural reforms to improve efficiency.
But the question with China, though, is that there's been so much government intervention, so much government stimulus, that you wonder, where is the real economy underneath?
That's the point, right? So if the slowdown is mostly driven by structural factors, I'm going to argue that indeed that's the case. So demand stimulus will not be very helpful. In fact, demand stimulus can be counterproductive. It can accumulate inefficiency, surplus capacity, like in the steel sector.
We can bring that into Japan as well, I think.
I have one question. The official number is about 6.7%.
6.7.
6.7. But some analysts say that your growth rate is much lower than that.
Not his, but
China's. Yeah, I'm American, but this dispute actually is very. You hear about this. Same thing people said about India. And I always say, of course, there's always a possibility. Number may be fraudulent and so on. I look at the data, and my judgment is that the truth is not too far from the government data for the following reason. One is, the economy is transforming very fast, right, to what used to be essentially manufacturing and exports-oriented to now more service-oriented, more consumption-oriented, less, foreign market-oriented. This transformation means some old firms are dying, new firms are emerging. The new economy firms, by necessity, when people go out to survey firms, you tend to oversample old firms. You tend not to think about surveying new firms until the new firm becomes bigger. So typical survey tends to be systematically missing the new expanding firms, tend to systematically oversampling slower growing, dying firms. That's reason number one. Reason number two, until recently, China, like Japan, has negative GDP deflator growth. Consumer price is moderately positive, producer price is negative. This is true both for India and Japan. And GDP deflator growth is negative. What does that mean? That means if you talk to a business people say, I don't believe 6.7% growth because I only see for my company a revenue growth of 5%. Exact same thing happening in India when I talk to people in India. They say, I don't believe government number. Well, there's actually one potentially good reason why business perception is wrong when government number is right. That's because government talk about real growth rate. Normally, we are used to thinking to go to real growth rate, you only collect data from nominal growth rate. Nominal growth rate, you subtract something to get real growth rate. But in today's world, you get nominal growth rate, you have to add something to get real growth rate. And that gap is actually very understandable. I think that's another reason.
Age of deflation. Huh?
Age of deflation is so unusual that our money illusion hurts us in the other direction, which we tend to think government growth is too high when when the truth is the other way around. On the question about reasons for a slowdown, there are cyclical factors. World economy is weaker than otherwise the case. Chinese trade to GDP ratio is much higher than for the U.S. The same weakness of global economy hurts China more than the U.S. That's cyclical factors. But they are, I think, play a relatively small role. Structural factors are more important, and there are two most important structural factors, I think, that help us to understand the growth slowdown. One is, since 2012, Chinese working age population is shrinking in absolute size, roughly at a rate about 0.3% a year. This means, other things equal, just having fewer and fewer bodies working every year will give you a lower growth rate in GDP terms. That's reason number one, and that's also a relatively new phenomenon, right? One has to get to.
So this is the backside of one-child policy.
That's the partly a consequence of one-child policy. The other is very rapid rising wages in the past, right? So that's a good thing for anyone who earns a wage, but also means that many industries that the Chinese firms used to be globally competitive are becoming less so today. India has almost the same population, but with wage only 1/3, sometimes 1/4 of China. Vietnam and many other countries, Indonesia, large population economies, much lower wages. So by necessity, China has to exit many industries and look for new sources of growth. International experience tells us, when the wage rate goes up, when the country has to switch to other things, other sources of growth rate tends to come down. So that's actually very natural within expectations. So the combination of these two things
normal,
for
but
the
not impending disaster.
My judgment is the concern for a major disaster is overblown.
The population decline and the aging would continue, right?
Indeed, population. Interestingly, the government recognized shrinking working age cohort is a problem, declining fertility is a problem. In November 2015, it relaxed family planning policy a little bit to what used to be called one-child policy to now two-child policy. The interesting thing is this relaxation, why it's meant, designed to help with the aging problem, in the next 15 to 20 years, will make growth worse. Why? Because no family has figured out how to produce a 20-year-old right away. So you can only produce children. So therefore, in the next 20 years, the working age people, number of working age people don't change.
But you would think
you're going to worsen the dependence ratio.
But that would feed the consumption model that China wants to move towards.
Well, change the structure of expenditure, yes, but the dependence ratio will get worse.
Right.
And dependence ratio, deteriorating dependence ratio is not good news for growth.
I wanted to switch. I wanted to see what your point of view on the Chinese economy is at this point in time.
It's not that fundamentally different from Shang-Jin's in the sense that I view the slowdown as due to long-run structural factors, not due to cyclical factors. I view it as healthy, that China is not trying to prop up growth unduly beyond what it's capable of. That is how you get one way in which you get bubbles and inflation and things you don't want. I do think, however, we have seen a bit of a change in China in the last 2 years that has to be recognized. I mean, everyone is very aware of the political change that came with Mr. Xi and the anti-corruption campaign and various other measures that have strengthened the state and cracked down on various things. There's an economic component to this. So it's not just, okay, anti-corruption, they're buying fewer American cars and they're going out to eat less. There has been a reduction in entrepreneurship, in risk-taking. There also has been, more importantly, some backwards motion in terms of the share of credit going to state-owned enterprises, the share of funding going to state-owned enterprises. So there had been a very long-term trend through several Chinese leaderships of the private sector, obviously, rising in importance, getting a larger and larger share of credit, and getting much higher returns on investment than the state-owned enterprise sector. And the last 18 to 24 months, as best we can tell, that has reversed. Now, part of that is the private sector's being rational and saying the trend growth rate's slower, we may have overinvested in real estate in third-tier cities, therefore we're not going to borrow as much.
Right.
And that's perfectly reasonable. But we are seeing this tendency to keep alive steel, cement, various things, and that's not helpful.
Yeah, despite the slowing down of growth rate in China, you've got to recognize that the Chinese GDP would continue to increase, and within probably next 10 years, Chinese GDP would surpass that of the United States.
Yes, that's a projection.
And that's still the prediction. Mm-hmm. So that according to the forecast of PricewaterhouseCoopers, I mean, by 2050, China would be number one in terms of GDP, and India would be number two. Right. And the United States would drop to number 3 in 2050. Yeah.
Well, that actually leads into a question. You've gone right to the question I wanted to ask you specifically. Given your role with an India Institute in Japan, is if there's concern about the Chinese slowdown, is India up to the task to fill in the gap? And secondly, fast growth elsewhere doesn't certainly, given its relative size, fast growth elsewhere in Asia, such as Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, do they fill in the gap, perhaps?
Yeah.
First, India.
In 2014, growth rate of China and India reversed. China came down to 6%, and India was growing at 7% level. And I think India is going to grow at 7% for some time to come, for 2 reasons. One is Indian population is very young, and the Indian population is going to increase quite dramatically toward 2050. So that would, certainly, increase the growth rates for India and maintain relatively high growth rate for India for some time to come. Mm-hmm. And another thing is Narendra Modi, government seems to be implementing, quite substantial reforms, and so far that has been quite successful. Mm-hmm. And increasingly, they are attracting, foreign firms. And many Japanese firms, particularly car producers and car parts producers, are now going to India. And that will again sustain the growth of the Indian economy for some time. So I would predict the Indian growth rate of about 7% to continue for the next decade or two.
But in my conversations over the last decade with Indian officials that have come through either London or New York, I often would hear the refrain, "Oh, we've got to reform. We're going to make it happen. It's going to be great. It's going to be unbelievable." In that mode of talk. And oftentimes it would just get chewed up in a buzzsaw of Indian government bureaucracy. I don't know. Do you think that they've solved that bureaucratic problem?
Well, one thing you have to note is Narendra Modi had a very successful management of the state of Gujarat. Mm-hmm. He was the head of the state of Gujarat for about 15 years. And because of that success of the state of Gujarat, he represented BJP, and he won the landslide victory in the election. So he is trying what he tried in the state of Gujarat and implementing, quite a number of reforms. And I am somewhat more optimistic than you about, his reforms.
Can I piggyback on this? I think there's actually a parallel with Japan. Everybody always talks a huge load, there's going to be this wonderful reform, that wonderful reform, except the U.S., which never reforms because it doesn't think it needs reform. But anyway, it does in healthcare. But anyway, and so there were a couple things that the Modi government did, and my Peterson colleague, Arvind Subramanian, is now Modi's chief economic advisor. There are a couple things that he did that are truly meaningful. And the biggest one is they've made progress on unifying the sales tax across these states. And actually in India, because it was the rules about the sales tax, not only the levels were so different, it was actually like you didn't have free trade within India. You also had problems with allocation of revenue because the sales tax was so uneven and so unevenly administered. Now, it's not completely done yet, but they have gotten it through the parliament. And they are making progress towards having a unified national sales tax, which will be one of the biggest transformations in India. There's a whole list of things they haven't done. The voluntary demonetization is nuts, okay? But that's a huge accomplishment. Voluntary for Modi, involuntary for everyone else. Right. But the parallel I want to make with Japan is, again, Abenomics. So on this stage, I know President Sakura and others have had many people speak about Abenomics. And people from Prime Minister Abe would show up with a PowerPoint or a deck, and it would have 32 points under 6 different headings. But bottom line, they got 800,000 women into the workforce who were not in the workforce 4 years ago. And this was probably the single biggest thing that they could transform in Japan unless they did immigration, which they're not going to do. And that was huge. And agriculture, again, partly conditional on TPP, there's actually been some real change in Japanese agriculture. So again, governments come in and they, for all these reasons, they list dozens of things they're going to reform, and so they always disappoint. But both in India and in Japan, there are some very real structural changes that have been made that I think should be recognized.
Mm-hmm. Can I also add some comments on India? India clearly has potential to deliver high and sustained growth because India today is similar to China in 1990 in terms of labor cost, in terms of having a head of a government wanting to do reforms. But they are beyond unifying taxes. There are 3 areas I think that they potentially would deliver major push for growth rates. One is land reform. Indians, for companies working in India, domestic or international, it's notoriously difficult to acquire land to set up factories.
It's notoriously hard for them.
Very hard.
Notoriously hard for them to actually to build a highway.
Or same thing, the land acquisition difficulty impedes infrastructure projects as well.
Yeah.
And the other is labor market reforms. It's notoriously difficult for firms to fire workers when there's a need, and those things government recognized, but the progress is very, very slow. The third area is to raise female labor force participation rate. Mr. Sakakibara mentioned about the good demographic pattern, but human resources are severely underutilized. When I was leading Asian Development Bank's research department, a group of my colleagues looking to female labor force participation rates in Asia, South Asia tend to lag behind any other parts of the country. Japan is doing pretty well relative to India, much better actually. But India is lagging behind, and the government doesn't want other people to talk about it. They strenuously object to World Bank, EDB, anyone else to bring up this topic. And
labor participation rate.
Very, very low female labor force participation rate. I mean, in Indian women are very well educated. I mean, there's part of Indian, female labor force are very well educated. Yeah. Certainly English speaking, but they are not as productively employed.
One thing which is very strange is major Indian banks are headed by women.
Yes, some of them. They certainly have a lot
of Indian women are CEOs of major companies, particularly the banks.
Well, some of them are heading U.S. companies too. But so there's no question that they are smart, hardworking, women in India, many of them. But the country as a whole is underemploying.
So if they're able to follow that Japanese model, or just the example anyway, you would expect to see a juicing of the growth rate in India.
Certainly, getting more women to be productively employed is could be another source of a high growth rate. So
we have time at the end for questions, but at this point in time, I thought I'd like to just let everybody have an opportunity to ask questions if you have. Or think about it if you're formulating something. All I ask is that you, 1, wait for the microphone, 2, tell me who you are and where you're from, and 3, make it a question, not a statement. So we have...
Yeah, before answering the question...
Yes, we have a question here, but go ahead.
Yeah, since, he mentioned about Abenomics, It is actually the doing of the governor of Bank of Japan. So I call that Abeconomics because governor of Bank of Japan is named Kuroda. And he aggressively is a monetary policy. When he was put in the position in the March of 2013. And this aggressive easing really did work. It depreciated the currency quite significantly, and it raised the equity prices by 60–70%.
I wanted to, well, you're stepping on a question I wanted to ask you specifically,
right?
but we're going to ask this gentleman first, please.
Hi, thanks. My name is Jack. I'm from the Institute for New Economic Thinking. Daniel, I think you posed this question in one way to Professor Wei before. China's growth model, particularly China's debt problem. In Japan, we've had the last decade, pretty much because of a real estate bubble that burst and that caused a balance sheet contraction of sort. In China, what does the debt problem look like? We know that it is very high. It is not so much in the household sector, but where is the debt concentrated, and what might be the way out of here?
Well, I just from my perspective, what my colleagues are reporting on and what I'm reading as well is that there's a real concern that the debt is growing kind of out of view in the provinces, in local municipalities, and it's kind of backed by what? I don't know. I mean, it's not necessarily tax receipts. So there's a lot of debt growing up in smaller pockets rather than just concentrated in, from Beijing, so to speak, from the central government. But please.
The gross debt coming from household, corporate, and government, the best estimates suggest is that they are on the order about perhaps 200% of GDP. And corporate debt is the biggest piece, and that includes some of the potentially local government debt, because local government borrow from banks, in the name of companies they control for. So that problem needs to be managed, and is a major macro risk to watch out for. It is useful to keep a cool mind on this. At this moment, it's not something that's likely to trigger a major economic crisis for the following reasons. So I first said it is a gross debt. The country's gross debt is smaller than gross assets. Country as a whole actually has a positive net asset. We know the country runs current account deficit, surplus for many years, and that means the country as a whole has a surplus. Corporate government also, has liabilities, but also has assets. So when you think about gross assets, one should also look at the gross assets and gross liabilities together. One, two. When the debt problem, so the debt problem needs to be addressed, right? And government shows that it seems to understand there's a problem. Now, to deal with the problem, you need to have you do one of the few things. So one is hopefully the growth rate will stay high enough so that debt to GDP ratio eventually will come down when growth rate is high. That's one. Two is you swap debt for debt. And three is you swap debt for equity. Let me explain what it means. Well, the central government's formal fiscal position looks relatively benign compared to other large economies. The central government debt on the book, the share of GDP is not that high relative to other countries. That means that local government debt, corporate debt, there's a possibility for them to swap. Right, so you have a bit more fiscal space. You can sort of provide some relief to the others, but you don't want to do it just like that. You don't want to just issue debt to replace the debt. That will not be very productive. The desirable thing to do is to force companies, local governments to reform, and then you use your fiscal space to help with potentially displaced workers to make sure no one has to go out to a street. The debt for equity is something that the Prime Minister talked about a lot. There's a role for that. The trick is to make sure the conversion is done on a market term, not on a shotgun marriage kind of arrangement.
Yeah.
But the overall debt, I think, is still manageable.
Thank you.
Well, I don't think Japan had lost decade or lost 2 decades. Some people say that. But this is the maturity of the Japanese economy. Japan had high growth period and stable growth period, and from 90 up to now, average rate of growth is 1%. But that is a result of the maturity, result of the affluence. And another thing, Japanese government debt is huge. It is 240% of the GDP. However, Japanese household savings is 360% of the GDP. So that most of the government debts are purchased by Japanese. 95% of the Japanese, government bonds are purchased by Japanese. So Japan, as a result, run current account surplus rather than deficits. So far, government debts, huge government debt, has not caused any problems for the Japanese economy. And for some time to come, this situation would prevail. Of course, maybe 5 years, 10 years from now, we have to raise revenues. We have to raise consumption tax from current 8% to 10% to 15%. But right now, we don't have any major debt problem, which is damaging the Japanese economy.
Any questions in the audience? Yes.
My name's Peter Burgess, True Value Metrics. Why don't we talk about something other than GDP growth? The GDP growth is, why don't we?
Well, I think that it's a catch-all for overall view, I would suppose, but perhaps the economists on the.
Do you mean we should talk about well-being, growth in well-being, or you talk about something else? That's the
human condition, you mean?
Okay. Ultimately, we want to talk about well-being. We haven't figured out a very good metric to measure their well that can be universally accepted. But ultimately, it's very, very clear GDP growth is not the ultimate goal. In fact, there are times when GDP growth can be positive and well-being may be deteriorating.
Yeah, I agree with him. Increasingly, interest of the Japanese people, many Japanese people are now shifting from buying goods to environment, safety, and health. And those are the 3 major sort of issues that are now being recognized by Japanese. And Japan is quite good in those areas. Japanese environment is quite good. Japan is probably the safest country among the OECD group. And, Japanese average longevity is the best in the world. So in terms of environment, safety, and health, we are the top runners in the world right now.
Let me make 2 comments in defense of the use, or not even the use, the focus at times on GNP or GDP. It's not to in any way dismiss human well-being. There are 2 reasons why I think, beyond simply the catch-all nature, why it's useful. The first thing is, as was sort of implicit in the discussion we had about China, an economy that isn't oppressed fundamentally has an underlying growth rate. It has technological progress, it has organizational progress, it has accumulation of savings, it has demographic factors. If the country is not achieving that growth rate in GDP, something is wrong with it. It may be something that's not its fault. It may be a balance sheet recession because they did something destructive in the past. It may be because the government is sitting too much on freedom. But it is useful. There is a high correlation between economies that deviate from their underlying growth potential for an extended period and human lack of welfare. It is a useful indicator. It's not all, but there is something wrong. If you think of a Zimbabwe, think of an Albania. You know, it tells you something's wrong if GDP isn't on average growing at a reasonable rate. The second thing is that as intrusive as trade deals or economic regulation is, ultimately focusing on economic goods allows people a certain amount of choice. So as SK just said, you can have Japanese citizens who decide, you know, environmental well-being is more important than nice cakes at the department store, whatever it is. But if you have a well-allocated tax system that's responsive to people's desires, which is a big if, but also if people can spend even in their own way on environment, they can choose to live further out of the city, they can choose to commute. That's up to them. If governments start getting actively involved in issues of human well-being, they sometimes have to be much more intrusive into people's lives than economic measures are. So you can shake your head all you want, but the fact remains that those are two good reasons why we focus on GDP if we're in liberal societies.
There are countries that officially looking at measures other than GDP to set government goals. So Bhutan is a country that people often talk about. You know, the king talks about gross national happiness. I visited Bhutan as an ADB official, partly because I'm very much interested in this concept. So I learned the following two things. One, the government indeed say the king tells the prime minister, and prime minister tells his cabinet colleagues that we should look at gross national happiness. And they do a survey once every 4 years, asking people, are you happy? And you know, how's your life in various aspects? And from which they come up with a gross national happiness index, 1. So they do that beyond GDP. They also calculate GDP. 2, unlike, contrary to popular report, most Bhutanese are not very happy, actually. So that the value of their gross national happiness is not very high. When you think about it, in fact, it's not very surprising because it's a very poor country. Material conditions are not that good. So while you measure happiness, in fact, material condition is an important component of it. Improvement in health, education, most other non-GDP related things actually requires economic development as well. So in fact, there's a more systematic data that just illustrate my point. United Nations Development UNDP program, UNDP, some years ago, proposed to have this human development index. And the motivation of this is to look at GDP is too simplistic, too narrowly focused. Let's look at a broader set of human development. And they look at GDP, look at education, health, and other stuff. And they've been publishing human development report for many years by now. Guess what? If you look at the human development index that UNDP releases, which country would have very high values? It's almost always high-income countries. It turns out the non-income part of human development tends to be strongly positively correlated with income level. So it doesn't say GDP is everything, but it turns out, on average, most times, in fact, having a good economic development tends to lay the foundation for society to develop other desirable things as well. Of course, the two are not perfect. I mean, there are times, I earlier mentioned, there are times when, you know, blindly pursuing GDP growth, you can undermine human development. Environmental degradation is one area. You know, China, I have a theory developed some years ago that argue that shortage of brides, gender ratio imbalance itself also promotes GDP growth. But that's a kind of growth that reduces happiness. Because it takes some time to elaborate, but I have some writings on this that show a concrete example in modern day world when sometimes you can have something that triggers, you know, gender ratio imbalance in this case, triggers harder work, more entrepreneurship, therefore faster growth, and yet people becomes less happy. So if you get rid of gender ratio imbalance, GDP growth may come down a little bit, but happiness can very well go up. So there are examples like that as well.
gentleman.
Thank you very much. Boyang Zhang from Ziff Brothers Investments. I'm an economist by training, so I'll ask a purely economic problem. I want to ask the panelists, are you worried about capital outflows in China? Because we know governments of modern economies have powerful tools, fiscal monetary policy, for domestic issues, but often the international capital movement is sort of the boundary constraints. Are you worried about continuing capital outflows in China, whether that's going to affect the economy? Thank you.
Is that to somebody in particular or everybody?
This is the whole panel.
Okay. Who wants to go first? Go ahead.
I'm not worried. 18 months ago, when the Chinese currency made its big downward movement and the US and others were freaking out, I said they can stabilize it when they want to, and they did. I think you have to look at it this way. If you're not Jack Ma, you're not the CEO of Huawei or Foxconn, and you have all these savings, because as noted, Chinese people have saved a lot of money. They got nothing to spend it on. They have very low investments, low return investments. They are going to be 99% in China, Chinese currency investments. And so it is a natural thing that if they're given the chance to diversify, they will. And so this is why I and a few other people warned, I think it was 6 different US Treasury secretaries, stop telling the Chinese government you want to have a market-determined exchange rate, because the first move will be down, and it will be down for a long time in a big way, because that will be the natural thing. And so the big movement down in the Chinese exchange rate came because the People's Bank of China had decided and had convinced their political masters that if they opened up the capital account and let people move money in and out, mostly out, not in, then there would be pressure on the system to reform and pressure to raise interest rates, and this would be ultimately good for China. And additionally, for reasons that none of us can really understand, they had all gotten convinced that being part of the special drawing rights at the IMF was a big deal, and so part of that was you were supposed to have a convertible currency, and you did that. And so when the Chinese government decided that this was not a good idea, they were able to put back in place a lot of the capital controls. Could they keep all money from flowing out? Of course not. Could they stem the flow by 80%? Yes. And after you've stemmed the flow by 80% and you've been sitting on $3.5 trillion of US treasuries that have declined in value as interest rates start to rise and are not offering you very much returns, gee, okay, I can spend $100 billion a month managing the downward flow of the yuan. So to me, this is not something to worry about. The issue is longer term, as has been the case for a number of transitional and emerging markets. At what point in the sequence and how do you open the capital account? And that's a non-trivial issue, and people like Shenzhen and others have worked on this. And that's not easy. But because China's so large, it's less important that it open the capital account quickly than it would be for some smaller countries that really need outside financing. So they're going to have to deal with it at some point. But I'm not worried by the outflow. I'm not worried about their ability to stem the outflow. I'm not even worried about them spending down their reserves to manage the currency down. That's as good a use for the reserves as anything else they're going to do with them.
Do you?
No. I have a question. I'll ask all of you actually, which is: are you at all concerned whether or not, given the new Trump administration, that the U.S. Treasury labels China a currency manipulator?
I'm concerned that if they do it, they will rightly be first laughed at, because there was a period when China was a very vicious currency manipulator. 2005 to 2008, they were intervening on a massive scale to undervalue their currency and to export unemployment to others. But they stopped, and for the last 18 months, they've been intervening to support the currency. So it's a little hard to call them a manipulator. And moreover, as with so many things the Trump administration is planning to do or saying they're going to do in terms of international economics, they're going to end up winning perhaps one little battle and making things worse for the long run for the U.S. So let's say they label China a manipulator on no basis at the moment. First, the Chinese government always could then say, okay, you want us to stop intervening? Great. Now, they won't do that because it's not in China's interest to see the currency drop 20%, but that threat is there. Meanwhile, if you're Malaysia, if you're Singapore, if you're Switzerland, if you're any one of South Korea, if you're any one of a number of other countries that actively manages the exchange rate and occasionally is accused by the U.S. of manipulating, and you say, well, the U.S. is beating up on China even when they're not manipulating, what's the point? Meanwhile, thanks to the Obama Treasury, thanks to Lael Brainerd and then Nathan Sheets, we actually had a pretty good agreement in the G7 and then the G20 not to engage in unilateral currency manipulation. In fact, the Japanese government, when the Abe, I'm sure SK didn't like this, but when the Abe government came in at the end of 2012, Finance Minister Aso started trying to talk down the yen and got ready to intervene. And because of the G7 commitment, they didn't intervene.
Right. You wanted to talk about capital outflow.
Yes, I want to say that there are three reasons that we are seeing capital outflow from China right now. One is diversification, and it's when people become rich enough, it's very natural for them to want to make sure they have their savings allocated in different assets, including those from abroad, and there's nothing to be worried about. But there are two other reasons. The reason number two is I think Chinese exchange rate is overvalued, and when there's a expectation that the current exchange rate is overvalued and it will come down, you want to take your saving out of the country before the devaluation takes place, and that's a sign that something needs to be reformed. And in fact, I think having a non-market determined exchange rate is a problem for the country. It suggests the importance for the country to make that move. The third reason for capital outflow is that some of the entrepreneurs and business people are worried about potential political risk that perhaps their property rights is not as secure. So some of the outward movement of capital is for that reason. And New York City happens to attract disproportionate number of such business people and such capital. That also is a sign that more reforms are needed to make sure that capital owners, business people feel secure about about what they have.
Your foreign reserves has declined quite dramatically, so that implies that you've been intervening quite aggressively.
For China, yes.
Yeah.
Very aggressively.
China aggressively.
It's a sign that exchange rate is overvalued.
Yeah.
That also, this exactly one of the data points that suggests that exchange rate reform is very, very important. So I differ from Adam's slightly. So Adam's view is that if you intervene to make it undervalued, it's a problem. If you intervene to make it overvalued, it's not a problem. But it's not a problem for the U.S. It is a problem for China, and in the long run, it will be a problem for the world economy as a whole.
That wasn't my view. My view was the following: that if you are in a time of less than full employment, you are actively pushing down the value of your currency. You are exporting unemployment to others, and that's why you want to have a multilateral agreement that binds not just a China but everybody, so you don't do that. I agree with you, currency misalignments matter, but I think it is a question of managed float versus other things. I'm perfectly happy to see the Chinese currency go down. I think it's in the Chinese own interest to lean against the wind so it doesn't go down precipitously.
It's also in the interest of the world economy for Chinese economy not to collapse.
Exactly. So don't set this up as though I've got some asymmetry portraying the U.S. as what you were doing was unfair and wrong.
So,
well, the U.S. Treasury,
I complained about the U.S. Treasury.
Yeah, but when the U.S. Senior Treasury official went to Beijing, they often say the following two things, in fact, three things. They say. A, please let market play a greater role in determining exchange rate. B, please do not devalue.
Right.
And three, if the two conflict, please forget about the first thing. Second thing is more important.
No, that's absolutely true. And that's the kind of stupidity that makes the U.S. less than credible. And that was a repeated thing, and I've said this to both Obama and Bush officials. And they would come out and say, well, we didn't really want to call him a manipulator because the State Department told us they'd get really mad if they did that. So we said this thing about, let there be a market-determined exchange rate. It's like, but you knew it was going to backfire. Well, anyway.
So quickly, just to answer the question, are you concerned about the U.S. calling China a currency manipulator?
Yeah, I don't think China is a currency manipulator. Yeah.
What about you?
I mean,
they do have some influence, but yeah.
This could be a problem if this is the onset of a trade war, and trade war will be mutually disruptive. When it's disruptive to two largest economies in the world, it will be a big negative for the rest of the world as well.
Yeah, apart from the currency manipulation, I am a little bit concerned about the anti-China position of your new president. Yeah, this really may generate some kind of, problems in Asian areas. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Sir, wait for a microphone.
Question is for Professor Wei.
Tell me who you are, please.
Oh, Govind Singh from Bank of America. For Professor Wei, you mentioned about the women's participating rate. Do you have a number? What is the participating rate of women, and is there a particular field those women are more so than other? Second question, what is the ratio between the national debt of China versus the household savings?
On the first question, you can get more precise numbers from ADB, Asian Development Bank report on female labor force participation rate. You talk about India in particular? Yeah, so my recollection is somewhere between 30 to 40%, which is very, compared to China's 70-some%. Japan is like 50-some%. So South Asia generally have a much lower female labor force participation rate. Reasons are varied. People mention about culture, but not just culture, the entire infrastructure, whether it's convenient and safe for women to leave home to work and so on. Those factors also discourage, participation in the labor force by women. Of course, education attainment, there's some gap there as well. So ADB report on the subject, I think, could be useful. It should be available on ADB website. That's one. On the debt and household savings, the Chinese households saves roughly 30% of their disposable income. It's very, very high compared to East Asian economies generally have very high household savings rate, but China actually stands out. India actually, by the way, also has very high household savings rate. It's just that the government deficit is so large and the corporate sector savings is not as large, so the national saving rate is not high. India runs a current account deficit in most of the times. Household savings rate is pretty high as well. Most common explanation for the high household savings rate in those economies have to do with culture, has to do with concern about, security, in retirement and so on. These are part of the reasons, but in my mind, they are not the entire story. In fact, in the last 20, 30 years, Chinese pension system have, for example, been developed and improved over time, and yet savings rate didn't come down. So one of the things one of the explanations I advanced, developed some years ago, has to do with gender ratio imbalance. So an unintended consequence of family planning policy was to produce unusually, people cannot have too many children because government policy says you cannot have too many children, and yet they have a preference to have a son among their offsprings, so they do gender-selective abortions. As a consequence, there are too many boys relative to girls at birth, which translates into not enough potential brides in the dating market, in the marriage market. So China has, India also, a shortage of brides. So the theory I developed is that shortage of brides leads people to raise savings rate. It leads, in particular, households with unmarried son to raise savings rate.
Oh, yeah.
Why? Because when there's a shortage of brides, let me first give you a magnitude. So currently, roughly 1 out of every 9 young Chinese men cannot find a girlfriend or wife, mathematically speaking, because the shortage, just the data, the ratio of the man woman is such that a non-trivial fraction of them cannot find a wife. So if you're a parent with an unmarried son, you're going to ask yourself, what can I do so that my son will not become an involuntary bachelor? Once you think about it, you realize that wealthy young men have an easier time to find a girlfriend and wife. In fact, wealthy young men, if you want to, can always find a girlfriend. In China, in Japan, in US, today and as well as in the past, there are no wealthy involuntary bachelors, period. As a result, you realize that to raise your household savings is one way to improve your son's marital prospect. So that's a theory. Evidence? Well, it turns out, and I give you 2 pieces of evidence. One is different parts of the country have different gender ratio imbalance. You find the household savings rate tends to be especially high in regions with very, very skewed gender ratio imbalance. That's evidence number 1. Evidence number 2, at the household level, household with a son save more than household with a daughter. Household with a, comparing 2 households with a son, so they have comparable income, same situation, both with a son. The household that lives in a region with very unbalanced sex ratio saves especially more than an otherwise identical household in a region with less sex ratio.
Interesting correlation.
There was a kind of one of these stories. You read. You're on the phone, and I clicked on it, and the story was about how it's the Chinese New Year, and something about renting a girlfriend. You can in China. There
parents
are
want to see.
Parents want to see, and so so to your point, but it's a money-making prospect. I wanted to switch a little bit back towards the hardcore of economics, talking about monetary policy. We have a Fed that is on a course for higher rates going forward. Central banks around the world have pushed on the pedal. There's no more pedal. They're through the floor. Their feet are on the ground at this point, trying to accelerate. But the U.S. has gone the other way. And so, Professor Sakakibara, how comfortable are you with the current Japanese monetary policy, and in the context of how might it change vis-a-vis a Fed that's clearly in that tightening mode, and we have fiscal stimulus coming here, perhaps as our new president says, bigly, as for big league. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. I may be a little bit biased on this issue because Mr. Kuroda, governor of Bank of Japan, is a good friend of mine.
Yes, I know.
He was my successor as a vice minister for international affairs. But I think his policy of aggressively easing the monetary policy has really succeeded. Well, United States started that, QE1, QE2, QE3. And we followed the United States in aggressively easing the monetary policy that, as I said, resulted in depreciation of the currency and rapid increase of the equity prices. So, and Mr. Kuroda is still continuing on, easy monetary policy. Mario Draghi in Europe. So among the developed part of the world, you are the first one, to shift the monetary policy toward tightening and raising interest rate. And that is driving dollar stronger. And, yen vis-a-vis dollar cheaper, and that is again comfortable for us for exports.
But where do you see? Okay, so tell me where every reporter would call you when you were a vice minister to ask you what you thought about, or would want to find out what you thought about the yen. So where do you think that the monetary policy or currency rates should be driving the yen at this point?
Well, because U.S. is now shifting your monetary policy, and raising the interest rates, and Japanese easy monetary policy would continue.
Yeah.
So that Japanese yen-dollar rate would be dollar appreciation or yen depreciation, which is not an uncomfortable situation for Japan. Mm-hmm. So we would not oppose to the shift of the U.S. monetary policy. But now Mr. Kuroda, Governor of Bank of Japan, is probably thinking about the exit. He has to stop the easy monetary policy somewhere.
Can he?
Not now. But he is starting to think about the exit.
Yeah.
Okay, when he could do that is something which he doesn't know. I don't know. Yeah, but maybe after the Tokyo Olympics.
Okay, so we've got a ways to go. But in terms of the rate, where do you see the rate, the dollar yen rate?
Dollar yen rate right now is 113, right?
Today was around 114.5 today.
Yeah, it would probably hover between the range of 110 and 115 for some time to come.
Okay.
Yeah. But as Trump fever sort of expires and this strong dollar phenomenon cease to exist, then yen might appreciate.
So do you think then, following on that, do you think, say 6 months from now, we might be having a very different conversation about dollar strength?
I think so. That's my prediction. My prediction is dollar yen rate may break 100 toward the end of the year.
Toward the end of the year?
Toward the end of the year. Mm. Yeah, but that's a prediction, which may be wrong.
Of course, all predictions. Dr. Posen, when you look at how Japan has weathered the storm, why do you think with all the stimulus, inflation remains so elusive? And why do you think that with all the dry powder of cash printing going on around the world, we haven't had this ignition of inflation? So two questions related.
I think they sound the same, but they're actually very different questions. So the idea, and I said this when I was at Bank of England, when I was active in making monetary policy, the idea that there was a mechanistic monetarism, that if you, whatever image you want, turned on the taps, put on the printing press, pedal to the floor, whatever it was, that this would automatically translate into inflation or growth was wrong. It depended crucially on the state of the credit conditions, it depended crucially on the state of the labor market, and it was much harder to do when the whole world was in recession at the same time, obviously. And so that part of it isn't, to me, a great mystery. And what we're seeing now with the Trump agenda is that, the basic physics sort of work, that if you do massive fiscal stimulus, and if you do a combination of tax cuts and regulations that shift income to capital, equities will rise and the economy will grow short term. It may not work for a long time, but it'll work. It's like any other populist boom. The Japan situation is very different. Not obviously, I'm nowhere near as close to Governor Kuroda as SK is, but I know Governor Kuroda quite well. I've been a strong advocate and fan of what he and the BOJ have done. But there's actually a very Japan-specific mystery, which is essentially under Kuroda and with the colleagues on the Monetary Policy Board, the Bank of Japan has done everything pretty much that mainstream macro people, I'm minor, but Paul Krugman, Larry Summers, Alan Blinder, John Taylor, pull the list. They've done pretty much everything you would have wanted them to do. They announced a positive inflation target. They printed lots of money and bought lots of government bonds. They started buying long bonds instead of short bonds, so they weren't just substituting for cash. They encouraged the yen to fall. They coordinated with the government, which in some people's minds reduce central bank independence, which should be inflationary. They did everything you could possibly have asked them to do. And they had some success in fighting off deflation, but like you say, they didn't get an upward cycle of inflation. And to me, this is actually a great mystery in economics. Because I see Hugh Patrick here, who's been mentoring me on Japan economics for 20 years almost now. When I first parachuted into this 20 years ago, I found Japan actually not that confusing, because a lot of the things going on were things that we've seen elsewhere, and that seemed to be the case till very recently. I actually find the Japanese economic situation, particularly the lack of inflation, more confusing today than I did in the 90s. In the 90s, it was the balance sheet recession. It was all these things we're familiar with. And there were policy mistakes. Today, the BOJ's done everything that we would think they'd want them to do, and also the currency did decline for quite a while. It came back up some, but it's not at 79 to the dollar.
Right. Yeah.
And yet the amount of inflation is very small. And so to me, this is a genuine puzzle. And I'll end here, I'm sorry, but just one more point. If, as I think most of us expect, we are seeing inflation start to come back in the US, I mean, nothing big, but we are seeing inflation start to come back in the US as we get to full employment and as we stimulate. And we are seeing inflation come back a bit in Germany and Spain and the parts of Europe that are doing well. Then the mystery about Japan gets even stranger, about Japanese inflation specifically, because then it must be something specific to Japan. I don't pretend to know what it is.
I have a different view from this. Well, I think for the developed part of the world, period of high growth rate, high inflation is over. Now, U.S. is a little bit different. U.S. has a developing part in the economy. But if you sort of look at European countries and Japan, growth rate is about 1%. And inflation is, we either have a deflation or disinflation. And I think this is the phase that we are in. We are mature economies. We don't have to grow at 3%, 4% anymore. People are relatively happy with the status quo. So 1% is fine. 1% growth rate, deflation or disinflation. That has become, I think, the major sort of pattern in the developed part of the world, except for the United States.
But do you think that that's a reason, that's a function of demographics? In the fact that if you have an older society, more interested in health and stability, as opposed to, being a younger person who, aggressively trying to make their way in the world and establish themselves, whether to have a wife or establish a business, that for lack of a better way of saying it, the animal spirits, do you think that is perhaps a reason why?
Yeah, economists like you always talk about the demography and aging, particularly with regard to Japan. It is true that Japan is a late.
Well, we have this problem in the United States too.
Yeah, aging society. But we are the healthiest old generation in the world, And I'm 75 now.
You don't look it.
I hope I look like in my 60s.
Absolutely.
50s. So they are very healthy and very active, old people in Japan who still works in various organizations. Mm-hmm. So that aging has not really caused any major problem for the economy at this moment. Mm-hmm. And besides, those old people desave. They sort of, consume out of their savings. So the savings ratio for Japan has come down from around 15% of the disposable income to almost zero right now. Yeah, and that is one of the results of the aging of the society as well.
Can I mention two potential dangers? One for developed countries, one for emerging markets, the way I see them. For developed countries, previously when central banks in virtually all countries pump out money, inflation didn't go up. Mechanically, we know somehow the velocity, the rate at which we convert broad money to price has collapsed. It's not too surprising because in theory, velocity is a function of interest rate. When interest rate low, a collapse. One of the unknowns is that when now we're trying to normalize monetary policy. We haven't seen inflation for a long time. We think we have solved that problem. There is actually a danger that perhaps velocity could return also faster than people are expecting, and therefore maybe inflation can come back.
But what's going to drive that?
We are hoping that the central bank will have the wisdom to manage this, time its move clever enough, appropriate enough that we will not see inflation back. Not just velocity come back. We have all the major central banks has such a huge balance stuff on their balance sheet that if velocity returns to the previous level, normally we should see much higher inflation.
But to Dr. Posen's point about Japan, it's a mystery. Why hasn't it come back?
Well, Japan is less mystery to me because it's part of the global trend, which is that velocity now collapsed to almost zero.
But what's going to trigger? That's why I'm asking. What is going to trigger
I think
it?
Expectation is what's going to trigger this. That when people are not expecting inflation, people are expecting a deflation. It's very hard for central banks to try to get them to change the inflation expectation. The problem is inflation is the expectation is a very fragile thing. That I'm worried that one of the less appreciated risk for developed country is that perhaps there will be a day when the expectation will flip, then the velocity will flip. There's some probability that inflation, in fact, will come back and to be a major macro risk.
I couldn't think of the day when many Japanese, expect inflation again.
Well,
they
now
are so
we
accustomed
don't.
to deflation.
I know we don't see that. That's where the danger comes. When we are not expecting suddenly I'm worried about the central bankers lag the policy.
You should recognize that what Chen-Jin just said basically contradicts a huge amount of, it may still be right, but it contradicts a huge amount of what the received wisdom of monetary economics has been for the last 30 years, because the whole point is you get inflation when you expect inflation, not you get inflation when you least expect inflation.
No, you don't need, what you're not expecting is the velocity can come back to
You've reversed causality three times. Sometimes you said velocity causes expectation. Sometimes you said expectations cause velocity. We've measured velocity. Velocity has gone up significantly in the U.S. With the balance sheet. Inflation has barely come up.
The risk is conventional wisdom on this is wrong again. That's the problem, right?
You can always say that.
For emerging markets, the history suggests that when U.S. interest rate goes up, it could pose danger for emerging markets through two channels. One is that higher U.S. interest rate often triggers realignment of global capitals, leaving emerging markets coming back to U.S. And this could create problems, especially for those countries whose investment depends a lot on international capital flows, especially the non-FDI capital flows. The second channel is that higher U.S. interest rate often generates currency depreciation of emerging markets. And this could be a problem, especially for those that have relatively high share of foreign currency denominated debt. We see.
Well, there's less and less of it. I mean,
less is on average, but there are countries that still have quite a bit of a foreign currency.
They do.
Foreign currency debt.
That was one of the benefits, I think, in the last 5 to 7 years of emerging market debt. That a lot more of it was done in local currency as opposed to relying on the dollar. We're just about out of time. I wanted to make sure that if there was maybe one last question from the audience, just to give one last lick. We can get it, but short. This gentleman right here, please.
Hi, Rick Puglisi from Aprecia Capital Advisors. My question is there any chance of creating a supranational currency to settle trade to help foster global cooperation, kind of like John Maynard Keynes did at Bretton Woods?
Are you talking about maybe a blockchain type?
Right, with blockchain, with Bitcoin, where you have a supranational currency, all trade is settled through that currency. And that way, you're fostering balanced trade. And it would be a way to maybe avoid the currency wars and avoid the trade threats and retaliation that we seem to be heading down towards.
Anybody want to tackle blockchain?
Well, my answer is absolutely no.
Okay. Too much national
I
interest.
refused to have SDL and try to sort of make it an international currency, but they didn't succeed.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Great. Well, we can take it up over drinks. Thank you all very much, and thanks to our panelists. Terrific. Thank you.